Hello, all my friends. Can we just take a moment? This is amazing. It's such an iconic image. Riding camels by the pyramids. It really captures the spirit of Egypt. But honestly, it's pretty misleading. There were no camels here when the pyramids were built over 4,500 years ago. And that's the thing about ancient Egypt. Instantly recognizable, yet so often misunderstood. I'm here to try to change that. Let's begin with the Great Pyramid of Giza, the final resting place of King Khufu. It rises more than 140 meters from base to peak. No wonder it still draws crowds, including Egyptologists now and then. It's hard to put into words, but we're about to dive deep into this iconic monument of ancient Egypt. The site is always bustling, and even though it's accessible, the climb upward feels symbolic. Like how Egyptian civilization literally rose from the earth to a true peak. So come along and I'll show you something incredible. Because the pyramids, they're really just the tip of the iceberg. Oops, hold on, let me get my balance. This whole area used to be a massive sprawling city. That's what makes it so fascinating. In this series, I'll be exploring what I consider to be the greatest civilization in history. Over 4,000 years of legacy that helped shape our world and left behind unmistakable traces we can still read today. I'll be digging into forgotten tombs, some of them totally mind-blowing. I've never entered a tomb quite like this. I'll also venture into hidden corners of massive monuments. It feels like standing on top of the world. We're in the Karnak Basin now, and it's no surprise that bizarre and fascinating theories about ancient Egypt pop up all the time. But what I find truly amazing is this. The most captivating civilization ever wasn't built by mythical beings or aliens. It was made by people not so different from you and me. That's the story I want to tell. A story full of hidden treasures, dark deeds, and occasionally controversial theories. For example, this mask, it was originally made for someone else. For the first time, I'm pulling everything together, from the earliest Egyptians to the final pharaohs. Wow, look at that. That's beautiful. Welcome to my journey through ancient Egypt. The big question is, how did it all begin? Where did the first Egyptians come from? And how did their extraordinary culture form? This timeless civilization was taking shape over thousands of years. Piecing it all together is no small task, but trust me, it's worth it. We're not starting with grand temples, though. We're beginning with some subtle clues you might easily miss. This is Kota, about 100 kilometers south of Luxor. Unless you're an archaeologist, you've probably never heard of it. There are no majestic temples or royal tombs here, but up on the cliffs you can see real signs of ancient life. Thousands of years before the pyramids, this is where the story begins. Welcome to Kota.
Joanne, thank you so much for having me here. It's so exciting. My first time in this place. I don't think anything gets past Dr. Dirk Heige's sharp eyes. He has something very special to show me. Not many people have seen it. It's a very recent discovery. These rock carvings tell an incredible story about the beginnings of Egyptian life. It's like a photo gallery from 19,000 years ago, complete with a hippo's back line, short tail, skinny legs, belly line, front legs, and even the mouth. It might even be smiling. Then again, hippos always look like they're smiling.
But the most common animals here aren't hippos, they're cattle. And not just any cattle, huge wild bulls, the ancestors of domesticated cows. These powerful images look like they're moving, charging even. Back then, beef was a staple, probably made up about half of their diet. So it's no wonder they became experts at depicting these animals. And they always chose high cliff spots with incredible panoramic views. Probably areas where people once hunted during the Paleolithic era.
It's easy to imagine those early hunters tracking their prey here. But the landscape looked completely different then. More like grassy savannas, green and fertile. Do we know why they carved these animals here?
We can guess, Joanne, but we don't know for sure. Maybe they believed it would help their hunting, some kind of hunting magic perhaps. It's truly magical to sit here and imagine the earliest nomads of Egypt passing right through this spot. By carving these animals onto the very rocks they saw around them, early people began adding human figures and boats too. The carvings became stranger and more varied over time. but they also gave us the first glimpse of the amazing things to come. These are the earliest signs of what would make ancient Egypt so unique.
Ancient Egypt, shaped by its dramatic landscape, evolved under intense environmental changes. Around 10,000 years ago, a slight tilt in the Earth's axis, just half a degree, had a massive impact on the climate. As the world began to change, Egypt would never be the same again. Back then, the people were nomadic herders, moving with the seasons after summer rains. Those rains were absolutely vital. They brought life, turning the land green and lush, supporting wild animals the people relied on. But of course, with climate change, those rains started to fade. And when the rains dried up,
Well, people and animals alike were forced to move towards the large lakes that appeared during the wet seasons. One such place was Narmer Palette, about 100 kilometers southwest of the Nile Valley. This is where these early hunter-gatherers began to settle, forming the first communities. But they still depended on the annual summer rains, so they had to find a way to predict when they would come. Their solution? They looked to the night sky. Welcome to the beginning of time, literally, because here at Narmer Palette is the oldest known calendar in Egypt, around 7,000 years old. This stone circle is the earliest evidence of how Egyptian weather watchers became expert astronomers. They aligned the central stones with the stars in the night sky. When the sun was directly overhead, the stones cast no shadow. That was the signal. The midsummer rains were near. It meant the animals would drink, the plants would grow, and life could go on for another year. In a way, this simple stone circle was the answer to a very real survival problem. But the Egyptians didn't stop there. What's really incredible about this little monument is that it's the oldest example of something that would become a signature of Egyptian culture, aligning their monuments with the heavens. From this point on, every tomb, every temple, every sacred structure would be aligned with the stars, with the gods themselves. If the stars and the rains were that connected to this world, then they must also connect to the next one and to the divine. One of the oldest carved monuments in Egypt dates back to around 5000 BCE. It was made from sandstone that was quarried over a mile away from where it was finally placed. That tells us something important. There was already a sense of community. People were working together toward a shared goal. The stone was hauled into place and then carved into a very specific shape. Now bear with me here, it might not look obvious, but some believe this carving represents a cow with strong hind legs and a clearly sculpted head. Cows were absolutely essential to daily life. They provided meat, milk, and even blood, major sources of protein that helped keep people alive. But cows weren't just important for survival. They were spiritually meaningful too. So important, in fact, that people believed they would need them in the afterlife. This belief eventually gave rise to Hathor, the great cow goddess. She may have started as a symbol of nourishment and abundance, but she grew into one of the most beloved and worshipped deities in Egypt. Hathor came to represent love, joy, beauty, and motherhood. Over time, her image evolved from a realistic cow to a woman's face with cow ears. And this stone may be the earliest depiction of Hathor we've ever found. But Hathor was just one of many. The ancient Egyptians couldn't get enough of their gods and goddesses. Over the centuries, they created hundreds, maybe even thousands of deities, each with their own role, appearance, and personality. Some gods looked human, others had animal heads. Some were male, some female, and some both. There was hardly an aspect of life that didn't have its own god. In the earliest times, the gods often reflected the familiar world, things people saw every day, elements of nature, and of course animals. Over time, those animals and their traits became more symbolic and divine. Each one represented a specific quality. Rams, for example, were associated with fertility, cows with motherly care and protection. And then there were the more dangerous creatures, animals that lived at the edges of the Egyptian world. Lions, crocodiles, jackals. But it wasn't just about identifying the right gods. It was about gaining power over them. Take Sekhmet, for example. She was a fierce lioness goddess associated with death and destruction. But by worshipping her, the Egyptians believed they could control her destructive force. The ancient Egyptians believed that dangerous forces could be calmed or even transformed into kinder gods. In many ways, they were trying to harness the power of nature to influence how it affected them in return. Religion in Egypt wasn't just about worship, it was the glue that held society together. It united the people and supported nearly every aspect of life. It was everywhere, in tombs, in temples, and in daily routines. But there was something even more essential. Without it, ancient Egypt wouldn't have existed at all. Later, Greek historians described Egypt as the gift of the Nile, and they were absolutely right. As the climate changed over time, the desert lakes dried up, leaving Egyptians with just one major source of water, the Nile. This river has an incredibly special origin, located in modern-day Sudan, where two great rivers, the White Nile and the Blue Nile, meet to form the longest river in the world. It flows from the heart of Africa all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. For much of the year, the White Nile, wide and calm, was the main source of water. But during the rainy season in the Ethiopian highlands, the fast-flowing Blue Nile would swell and flood the river. Today, dams like the ones at Aswan control these floods. But until the 20th century, enormous amounts of water and nutrient-rich silt would flow downriver, flooding the entire Nile Valley. This yearly flood brought life and fertility to the deserts of Egypt. The annual Nile flood was the most important event in every ancient Egyptian's life. Its waters carried nutrients and minerals that enriched the soil, allowing agriculture to thrive. Egypt had some of the most fertile land in the world, perfect for growing everything from sweet corn and garlic to bananas, sugarcane and cotton.
Farming here was intense, wasn't it? The land gave people so much, right?
Yes, but the land also needs rest. We plant once, then leave it for a month before using it again. It's amazing, it only needs 1 month of rest before it's ready to grow again.
Sometimes just 15 days, sometimes a whole month.
Exactly. It really shows how rich and generous the land of Egypt has always been. It gave people everything they needed. And it was the Nile that turned this desert land into a paradise. About 7,000 years ago, people who could no longer survive in the ever-drying desert landscapes were forced to migrate toward the Nile, their only remaining source of water. And that's how ancient Egypt began, as groups of people gathered along the Nile's banks. In the north, settlements popped up around the delta and the Fayum. In the south, they formed near the bend at Kina. This was the beginning of what became known as the two lands of Egypt, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, two distinct cultures, but both built around the incredible yearly miracle of the Nile's fertility. One of the oldest settlements in Upper Egypt was El Kab, just south of the Kena Bend. It may not have the same wow factor as the pyramids, but archaeologically it's even more revealing. It shows how Egypt evolved. Here, you can actually see how nomadic life gradually gave way to a stable, structured society. It wasn't a quick change, it happened slowly, but archaeologist Elizabeth Hart can trace every stage of the transformation.
Oh wow, you're working in a really remote spot, but the weather here is much cooler. It's actually beautiful.
At this level, we have barren soil. No one was living here. But starting around 4,200 BCE, we find layers of Nile flood silt, followed by wind-blown sand, then more silt, and then more sand again. You can see it clearly. A thin layer of silt from the Nile flood, followed by sand.
And here we even have a hearth, a fire pit. That tells us people were living right on top of these layers, coming into the Nile Valley and then leaving again. We've also found lots of pottery shards and stone tools in these layers. It's a small space, but there's a whole story of real human life unfolding here, isn't there?
We've got thousands of years of history in this one area. When we started, people were just beginning to move into the Nile Valley. They were just starting to farm. And eventually, boom, we get the pharaohs and a unified Egypt. It's amazing when you think about how much change happened on just this one patch of sand. Even though we're still centuries away from the grand monuments of the pharaohs, you can already find signs of the lives these ancient people lived, if you look closely enough. Not much has survived, except tons of pottery.
Yeah, this piece is about 5,000 years old.
5,000 years?
These pots help us date when this early society began producing food surpluses. That was a turning point. When people could grow more food than they needed strong pottery to store large quantities of food and drink. This was the beginning of civilization. Some of the molds from a slightly later time are among the most common discoveries. The way it worked was simple. You'd heat the mold, then place the dough inside. The heat would bake the bread right there in the mold. These molds were used on a huge scale. And these are beer jars. Ooh, nice, that's a beautiful beer jar.
This is really the nuts and bolts of how we piece together Egypt's early timeline, isn't it?
Yeah, pottery is especially important for understanding how people lived. But in Egypt, daily life was only half the story.
What really set the ancient Egyptians apart was how they viewed death. To them, death wasn't the end of life. It was the beginning of a new one. A transition from the world of the living to an eternal afterlife. And that belief led to one of Egypt's most mysterious and fascinating practices, my favourite topic, mummification. While the origins of this mysterious tradition are now clearer, the act of burying the dead held deep meaning even in Egypt's earliest days. Here's a typical burial from around 3400 BCE. The body was wrapped in a fetal position and placed in a small pit, reconstructed here. He was surrounded by things that probably mattered to him in life: pottery, jewellery, and a cosmetic palette. Everything important to him in life went with him to the grave. And I think that says something really powerful. Even 5,500 years ago, Egyptians believed in taking everything with them. Clearly they thought something happened after death. Death wasn't an end. It was a shift into another kind of existence, where you kept on living. So naturally they thought you'd need the same things you needed in life. This body was naturally mummified by the hot desert sand. But his position probably wasn't accidental. Even in death, preserving the body was essential, because the soul needed a place to live forever. A skeleton wasn't enough. Bones are anonymous, they don't really feel like you. But when the soft tissues, skin and hair are still there, you still look like yourself. And that's exactly what this person represents. Being face to face with one of the earliest Egyptians gives us a window into how their ideas about the afterlife evolved. At first, it was practical, burying the dead in a small space, wrapped up. But then layers of meaning developed, like the fetal position, symbolizing rebirth into the next world. It's kind of like a seed from which all of Egypt's funerary beliefs grew. This was the true beginning of a process that would be repeated millions of times throughout Egyptian history. It was a blend of the mystical and the practical, which really sums up the Egyptians at their core. From the very beginning, the Egyptians were masters at making sense of their world, no matter how confusing or complex it was to others. That same drive for order is clear in how they built their early society, with an almost obsessive level of bureaucracy. In Abydos, one of Egypt's oldest cities and the site of the first royal tombs, archaeologists discovered the early roots of systems we still deal with today, like taxation. It's fitting that the city of the dead is where we found the first tools for calculating the other great certainty in life taxes. We know this thanks to small tags made of bone or ivory, like these, dating to around 3250 BCE. They're about the size of a postage stamp. Each one has carvings of animals, birds, plants and more, plus a hole for tying it to a jar or box. Those containers probably held goods like flaxseed oil. And the symbols are believed to represent the regions where the goods came from, regions that sent these products as taxes. These little tags show how early Egyptians were already able to collect goods from a wide geographical area. Some scholars even think these images were pronounceable. Simple drawings turned into sounds. If that's true, then these tags might be the world's earliest form of writing. Isn't it wild to think that the first writing system in human history didn't emerge to express poetry or emotion? It came from a need to keep track of taxes. Eventually, these simple signs developed into a full writing system, hieroglyphs, literally sacred carvings. These symbols covered every part of Egyptian life. We couldn't even begin translating them until 1822 with the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. There had to be a shared language to move goods between Upper and Lower Egypt. Lower Egyptians also began building trade networks with the wider ancient world. But as more and more militant regions emerged in Upper Egypt, it became clear that the Nile had given rise to two very different cultures. And in many ways, that's where the next big chapter begins. The only real thing uniting these early Egyptian cultures was the great Nile River. The inevitable clash between them is captured on what many consider the founding document of ancient Egypt, a giant ceremonial makeup palette. This is a replica of the original Narmer Palette. As ornate and symbolic as it may be, it shows the crucial moment when King Narmer from the south defeats his northern rival. Just seconds after he strikes him with the mace, the enemy is executed and gone. Narmer is considered the first king of a unified Egypt, meaning the entire country was now under the rule of one man. He literally declares himself a god king, becoming the single most important figure at the top of the social pyramid. From him, everything else flows. At this point, Egypt becomes the world's first nation-state. So what made ancient Egypt ancient Egypt? It's all here. The art style, the religious changes, and even the world's first writing system, hieroglyphics. Now, about the name Narmer, it's written using a catfish and a chisel. Yes, a catfish. He's shown protected by Hathor, the cow goddess, and standing next to Horus, the falcon god of kingship. Narmer is already wearing all the royal symbols that future kings would adopt. A royal beard to show masculinity and strength, and of course the bull's tail, a powerful symbol. Just tie a little tail to your belt and boom, you channel the strength of a bull. This palette is the earliest historical record of Egypt, a blueprint for how every pharaoh would be portrayed afterward, surrounded by gods. But perhaps the most iconic part is Narmer's striking pose, with the mace raised high. That powerful image would be repeated endlessly through thousands of years of Egyptian art. Even though it's depicting a brutal death, a blow to the head, Egyptian artists somehow made it look almost like ballet. They elevated the violence into art, while still keeping the message crystal clear. For the next 3,000 years, every pharaoh would try to connect themselves to Egypt's first king in order to rule legitimately and successfully. To do that, they had to engage with Egypt's complex spiritual and social hierarchy, in life and the afterlife. That's why their names were written down in royal king lists, like a family tree of pharaohs. One of the best preserved versions is at the Temple of Seti once in Abydos. There, Seti includes himself and 75 royal ancestors, tracing the line back to Narmer. One detail that stands out is that Seti is shown with his young son, the future Rameses the Great, reading these names on a scroll of papyrus. It's as if Seti is telling the gods, "Look, I'm pharaoh now, and here's my son, the next one in line." In total, Egypt had over 300 pharaohs, grouped into 30 dynasties. But for Egypt's earliest kings, it wasn't enough to just be immortalized as male rulers. They had to prove their divinity by exercising complete control over their subjects. And we have evidence of this in the desert around ancient Abydos, site of the first royal cemetery in Egypt. This place was the original Valley of the Kings. Here you really feel how important this valley was to the ancient Egyptians. The wind whistles through, swirling the sand, and if you listen closely, they say you can still hear the whispers of the dead. This is where Egypt's earliest kings were buried, in huge underground tombs like this one, the final resting place of Egypt's third pharaoh, King Narmer. It's one of the largest and most complex tombs of the first dynasty. Though it was uncovered in the sands, it clearly shows how much power the king still held even in death. King Narmer himself was buried in the central chamber,